In a world divided by war and distance, something unexpected is happening. Ukrainian women, searching for peace, are finding love not in Europe, but in the Philippines. Why are these women crossing continents for Filipino husbands? And what do they know about love that the rest of the world doesn't? This is the true story of how warmth, faith, and family can change everything. In the winter of 2023, rumors began circulating in unexpected places. A Ukrainian grandmother in Lviv whispered it to her neighbor at the market. A newlywed couple in Odessa shared it at a cafe, and soon it became undeniable. Ukrainian women were choosing Filipino husbands at rates no one could explain. But this wasn't a trend born overnight. It emerged from years of silent connections, digital pen pals, wartime upheavals, and cultural shifts. It began with whispered stories online. A Ukrainian woman posting a photograph of her Filipino partner with a simple caption, "He chose me when the world felt unsteady." That single post drew thousands of comments from other Ukrainian women saying the same thing. "He treats me like I've been waiting to be seen." What started as a curious anomaly became a quiet revolution in love, identity, and cultural exchange. The question everyone kept asking but few could answer was simple and haunting: why? And that question grew louder not because it was trendy, but because the stories behind it were too compelling to ignore. Meet Alina, a 29-year-old architect from Kiev whose life was as predictable as the skyline she designed, until the day she met Rico. Their first message exchange began with banter over volleyball skills and favorite foods. She was intrigued by his humor. He was captivated by her intelligence. But the real connection came later, on a night when Alina felt the world closing in around her. She wrote about the uncertainty of life under the ongoing war, the pressure of caring for her aging parents, and the loneliness that crept into her bones. Without hesitation, Rico listened. He didn't offer cliches or empty reassurances. He responded with honesty and warmth, saying simply, "You deserve peace." Even that simple sentence cracked something inside Alina. She didn't know it yet, but that moment would be the hinge on which her whole life turned. This wasn't another online flirtation. It was the beginning of a collection of Ukrainian stories that defied geography, expectations, and tradition. Across the sprawling archipelago of the Philippines, Filipino men began to notice an unfamiliar trend too. Messages began arriving from Ukrainian women, not just friendly greetings, but heartfelt chats loaded with vulnerability and curiosity. Some Filipinos initially thought it was a quirk of algorithmic dating apps, a glitch connecting distant users. But as the messages multiplied, a pattern emerged. Ukrainian women weren't looking for novelty, they were seeking substance. They spoke of fear and resilience, of longing for stability and emotional safety, of having survived disruption and wanting companionship that felt rooted, kind, and unshakable. Discourse groups formed, not just in Ukraine but in Manila, Cebu, Davao. Deep conversations about emotional intelligence, family values, and what it meant to offer loyal partnership in uncertain times. Filipino men accustomed to courting Western European or American partners began noticing something remarkable. Here were women who didn't prioritize surface attractions but sought depth, empathy, and unwavering commitment. And many discovered in return that Filipino men possessed a blend of patience, humor, and loyalty that felt rare, valuable, and genuinely life-changing. Alina's story was just one of many. There was also Katerina, a music teacher in Kharkiv, whose fiancé left shortly before war broke out. Her heart hardened, her trust broke, and she swore off love altogether, until she received a message from Marco, a Filipino graphic designer who had lived through his own heartbreak years ago. His approach wasn't flashy. He didn't use poetry or extravagant lines. He asked her what song she couldn't stop listening to. When she replied that she played it daily because it helped her sleep, he didn't tease or judge. He said, "Then let's find new songs together." And so they did, spending hours swapping playlists, sharing stories of their childhoods, their favorite memories, and the things they were certain about in a world that often felt uncertain. Months passed, and Katerina found in Marco a patient listener and a creative soul who didn't rush her. What she initially thought was casual digital comfort became something tangible, a connection so genuine she began to dream of a future no longer rooted in fear, but possibility. Like ripples widening in water, her story echoed across online spaces, and more Ukrainian women began to share their own Filipino friendships turned love stories. Many Ukrainian families were bewildered. They had watched their loved ones suffer through loss and instability, and now they were hearing that their daughters were falling in love with Filipino husbands, men from a culture few understood. Why Filipino men? Why not locally? Why not closer to home? The answers were as complex as the women who lived them. For some, the appeal was in the emotional literacy Filipino men displayed in conversations, a readiness to listen without judgment, to be vulnerable without fear, and to treat partnership as a shared journey rather than a conquest. Others spoke of family values instilled from childhood, where respect for elders, community cooperation, and tender communication were emphasized. Meanwhile, Ukrainian men, many of whom were bracing themselves for military conscription or economic instability, had different emotional currencies to offer. Slowly, it became clear that what these Ukrainian women sought was not an escape, not a trend, but a reflection of healing, a way to rebuild trust in relationships after years of trauma. And the Filipino men who responded were not interchangeable. They were intentional, empathetic, and often quietly courageous in their willingness to love across borders and hardship. In a small cafe in Manila, two friends, Jose and Miguel, would jokingly compare the influx of Ukrainian messages to a cultural buffet. They laughed about the oddity at first, then realized this wasn't superficial or fleeting. They watched as Ukrainian women asked deeply personal questions about family, emotional boundaries, past struggles, and future dreams. They weren't seeking fantasy. They were seeking authenticity. In time, some of those conversations evolved into video calls, late-night confessions, and plans for visits once travel became possible. When Jose met Alina from Kiev over Zoom for the first time, it wasn't fireworks or theatrical romance. It was calm, honest conversation about mutual values, life goals, and shared resilience in facing uncertainty. After months of daily calls, they discussed what their life could look like if they were together. Quiet Sunday mornings with coffee, shared laughter over small mishaps, evening walks under mango trees. Suddenly, Alina's dreams shifted from survival to belonging. Jose wasn't her rescue story. He was her partner in rebuilding a life touched by pain, but softened by connection. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, entire communities began to take notice. Groups of women in Kherson gathered regularly to share not just their grief, but their growing online friendships with men from across the globe, particularly from the Philippines. These were women who had grown up with the narrative that loyalty was rooted in proximity and tradition. Yet here they were, forming bonds with men thousands of kilometers away. People whispered, debated, some disapproved, others were intrigued. But one thing became unmistakably clear: these connections were real. They weren't romanticized fairy tales marketed for likes and views. They were raw, patient, slow-burning, deeply communicative relationships rooted in mutual respect. There were meetings, laughter, tears shared across time zones, and plans meticulously made for future reunions. And when a handful of these women announced engagements or weddings, the world didn't treat it as a social experiment. It treated it as testimony to the resilience of love in times of upheaval, and the surprising places where human hearts find each other. For some, the catalyst was wartime displacement. After bombings, evacuations, and displacement made home feel tenuous, Ukrainian women began asking themselves, what do I want from life when everything is uncertain? And they realized they wanted someone who could walk beside them in the unknown, not someone to lecture them about stability. They wanted conversation, not silence. They wanted grace, not criticism. They wanted someone who could hear the strain in their voice and simply say, I'm here. Filipino men, socialized in a culture that valued warmth, familial attachment, and emotional generosity, were increasingly present online in language groups, dating apps, and friendship platforms. Their profiles didn't promise luxury or grand gestures. They promised partnership. It wasn't about economics, nor exotic fascination. It was about sincerity. Ukrainian women weren't fleeing their homeland. They were seeking companionship that felt human, true, and expansive rather than confined by fear. And as more relationships formed, a quiet cultural bridge began to take shape, one that defied historical assumptions about East-West connections. Then there was the case of Victoria, from Mariupol, whose world had been shaped by loss and relentless upheaval. She logged onto a forum one night, exhausted and disillusioned, able only to type one line, "What if love isn't meant to hurt?" Someone replied from the Philippines. His name was Dante. He didn't offer romantic poetry. He simply said, "Love isn't meant to hurt, but it is meant to heal." That moment shifted something in Victoria, not immediately, not dramatically, but subtly, like dawn changing color. Their chats didn't start with grand fantasies. They began with genuine conversation, talking about favorite books, childhood memories, how each of them cooked their grandmother's recipes. Slowly, each disclosure built trust. When Victoria spoke of her fear of abandonment, Dante responded not with platitudes, but with understanding and reflection. It wasn't instantaneous romance. It was intentional presence. And over months, a bond formed that was neither rushed nor naive, but painstakingly real, proving that love, in its most reliable form, grows where vulnerability is met with care. It wasn't long before the phenomenon reached international awareness. Journalists, sociologists, and relationship experts began asking questions. Why Filipino men? Why now? Why Ukrainian women? Some theorized that globalization alone explained it. Others said it was the neutrality of digital platforms. But the women themselves offered a simpler explanation. These men listened. Not superficially, truly listened. They responded with empathy, not judgment. They didn't fix problems. They acknowledged them. And in a world of transactional relationships, that was revolutionary. What began as an anecdote blossomed into narratives of engagement announcements, cross-continental commitments, and blended families. These weren't stories of escape. They were stories of reclamation. Women who had lost faith in love were rediscovering trust in human connection, and Filipino men, many of whom had deep traditions of family devotion and emotional generosity, were meeting them with nothing to prove but sincerity. And the more these stories surfaced, the more others began to wonder, what if love's answer doesn't always look like we expect it to? For some families in Ukraine, the phenomenon wasn't just a curiosity, it was a turning point in how they viewed relationships and future partnership. Mothers who had raised daughters with traditional expectations of local suitors suddenly found themselves listening to stories of patience, respect, and cross-cultural compassion that rivaled anything they had imagined. Fathers who worried about financial stability began to reconsider what stability truly meant. Not just economic comfort, but emotional reliability and partnership built on mutual understanding. Social circles buzzed with incredulity. A Ukrainian woman engaged to a Filipino man? Yet behind every headline and whispered conversation were rich, layered stories of connection that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with sincerity. These relationships weren't built on exoticism or fantasy. They emerged from real conversations that spanned months, sometimes years, where both parties showed up consistently, vulnerably, and authentically. When a woman from Zaporizhia announced her engagement to a Filipino pilot she'd met on an international language exchange platform, it wasn't treated as a trend. It was seen as testimony to how love adapts and evolves, especially when people refuse to settle for superficiality. In Manila, the phenomenon sparked cultural curiosity and graceful reflection. Filipino men who found themselves in committed relationships with Ukrainian women didn't talk about conquest or novelty. They spoke about growth. They spoke about how these relationships challenged them to broaden their emotional vocabulary. Many admitted they had never before expressed their fears so openly or discussed long-term vulnerabilities with someone who asked questions that went deeper than casual small talk. Conversations evolved from hobbies and travel dreams to experiences of trauma, longing, ancestral memory, and emotional resilience. In this exchange of inner worlds, both partners found relief. Someone finally understood their hurt without minimizing it, and someone finally appreciated their ambition without demanding they shrink themselves. Weddings were planned with vibrant fusion, Ukrainian traditions mingling with Filipino customs. In some ceremonies, bouquets were passed around with the word kapwa embroidered into ribbons, honoring the shared self that defined their relational philosophy. It was no longer about cultures colliding. It was about cultures harmonizing, not perfectly, but fully, deeply, and with respect. Even those who remained single watched these stories with fascination, finding in them a powerful reminder that relationships can transcend geography when built on empathy, attention, and shared humanity. Back in Ukraine, the social discourse grew more nuanced. What had once been met with skepticism, why would a Ukrainian woman marry a man from so far away, evolved into something more reflective. Why not? People began to understand that partnerships aren't defined by proximity, but by emotional currency. And in a society strained by years of conflict, displacement, and disruption, Ukrainian women found value in men who were willing to listen rather than lecture, who offered emotional steadiness rather than impatience, who respected autonomy rather than sought control. It wasn't that Filipino men were perfect. It was that they offered an alternative relational model, one built on warmth, careful communication, and the kind of family devotion that wasn't performative but foundational. Parents who had once worried about Western isolation began to see that the real question wasn't where their daughters' partners came from geographically, but whether they entered relationships with intentional goodness. When a group of Ukrainian women held a panel discussion about these cross-cultural connections, the room was packed with mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends asking honest questions. What values matter most? What does emotional safety look like? And from that conversation emerged not judgment, but curiosity, a genuine willingness to understand love that crossed oceans and cultural templates. Not all stories were effortless. With distance came complications, visa hurdles, family resistance, language barriers, and occasional heartbreak when relationships didn't take root. One woman, Natasha from Chernihiv, spent months communicating with Lido, a Filipino marine engineer, only to find that they wanted fundamentally different life structures once they met in person. They parted with mutual respect and gratitude, proving that these relationships weren't about possession. They were about growth. Both walked away changed, carrying lessons about boundaries, expectations, and emotional maturity. Even these endings contributed to the larger narrative. Not every connection was meant to become forever, but every true connection offered something invaluable, self-knowledge. And many women said that was worth the risk alone. They learned what they valued most: honesty over ease, depth over convenience, and compassion over indifference. Even when love didn't become lifelong commitment, the bonds they formed reshaped their understanding of partnership. They didn't walk away resentful. They walked away wiser, more compassionate toward themselves and future partners. These stories reminded everyone involved that sometimes the value of love isn't measured in longevity, but in how it reshapes who you are. Across social platforms, a quiet but powerful dialogue emerged. Ukrainian women began sharing nuanced reflections. I didn't fall for nationality. I fell for people who treated me with dignity. These weren't marketing slogans or romanticized captions. They were sincere testimonies rooted in lived experience. Men from the Philippines responded with their own vulnerability. I didn't seek someone from afar. I found someone who taught me patience and presence. In these shared spaces, something remarkable happened. Women who had once felt unseen by partners in their own communities found resonance in men who genuinely listened. And men who had once been casual about emotional engagement found themselves learning, growing, and sometimes unlearning old relational patterns. What was most striking wasn't the geographical distance. It was the emotional proximity these partnerships forged. Threads of shared hope, vulnerability, and redefined masculinity wove through hundreds of stories that, when taken together, formed a tapestry of new relational norms, relationships not rooted in convenience but in conscious care. The rise of these cross-cultural unions also began to influence community perspectives on masculinity and emotional expression. In centuries past, both Ukrainian and Filipino societies had taught men to embody stoicism and strength, albeit in different cultural languages. But these emerging relationships demonstrated a subtler kind of strength, one that wasn't about emotional restraint, but emotional availability. Filipino husbands, often raised in cultures where familial warmth and relational emphasis were integral, showed partners how tenderness could be a form of strength rather than weakness. And Ukrainian women, shaped by resilience in the face of historical and contemporary challenges, taught their partners about grit, loyalty, and the power of survival. Together, they forged relational identities that balanced softness with resilience, a co-creation of emotional literacy. Family members on both sides began to appreciate this unique blend. Filipino mothers spoke of how much they admired their daughters-in-law's courage, while Ukrainian parents began to respect the steady kindness they saw in their sons-in-law. What started as surprised curiosity became admiration, and soon, what mattered most wasn't nationality but compatibility of heart, values, and mutual respect. Occasionally, doubt surfaced. Some critics argued it was digital illusion, that screens create intimacy without accountability, and that once in person, reality would disrupt the ideal. But the majority of couples proved otherwise. When Yulia from Odessa met Arnel from Cebu in person for the first time, the connection deepened rather than dissolved. They discovered that while some details were lost in translation, quirks, humor, mannerisms, the essence of their connection was even stronger in person. They laughed about mispronounced words, shared meals together, and learned family customs. They realized that authenticity isn't about flawless understanding. It's about the willingness to try, to ask, to learn. And as they navigated differences, their respect for each other flourished. This wasn't naive romance. It was intentional partnership. And when they announced their engagement surrounded by both Filipino and Ukrainian family members, it wasn't met with bewilderment. It was met with tears of joy, hopeful applause, and genuine celebration. Their union wasn't a novelty. It was a testament to how love, when anchored in mutual care, empathy, and shared values, is both resilient and transformative. Children born into these cross-continental families became living testaments to cultural synthesis. They carried Ukrainian and Filipino heritage in their laughter, in the foods they loved, and in the languages spoken at home. On weekdays, they might hear Tagalog lullabies sung with gentle cadence. On weekends, they might learn Ukrainian folk songs with rising pride. Schools noticed these children's unique worldview, expansive, curious, culturally fluent, and emotionally expressive. Teachers often asked parents how they nurtured such openness, and the answer was almost always the same: modeling empathy, honoring dual identity, and teaching cultural respect as a core value. In many ways, these children were bridges in human form, embodiments of what it looks like when love crosses borders without erasing identity. And as these blended families gathered for celebrations, fiestas infused with borscht and adobo, dances spanning Kyiv and Cebu, traditions interwoven like threads in a tapestry, communities began to see that culture isn't a boundary but a beautiful exchange. In these homes, two worlds lived not as separate entities, but in creative tension and joyful harmony. Local organizations began to notice these emergent family patterns and saw potential for deeper cultural collaboration. Not merely ceremonial weddings, but long-term social programs to support blended families with language learning, cultural immersion, and community networking. In Manila, Ukrainian artisans taught traditional embroidery workshops. In Kyiv, Filipino musicians shared rhythms that evoked joy and communal warmth. These were not token events. They were organic extensions of deepening cultural exchange fueled by love and curiosity. Government cultural departments took note and began promoting formal exchange initiatives, highlighting how these transnational relationships fostered mutual understanding between nations often separated by geography but connected through empathy. And in homes across both countries, families who once spoke of cultural difference with caution now spoke of it with reverence, celebrating how much each partner learned from the other's heritage while forging their own shared identity. What once appeared as an anomaly now became a movement, a testament to the power of connection that transcends borders and reshapes what it means to be a family. At the heart of this story are the countless women who dared to redefine what partnership means in a world rife with uncertainty. They weren't rejecting their homeland. They were expanding their emotional horizon. They sought not escape, but alignment. Alignment with someone who listened with intention, cared with devotion, and walked beside them with consistent empathy. These relationships were not carefree ventures. They were courageous commitments, invitations to vulnerability met by reciprocal respect. And the Filipino husbands who stepped into these unions weren't chasing novelty. They were choosing love with patience and purpose. Their openness to cross-cultural understanding became an emotional bridge rather than a barrier. More than anything, this movement reminded the world that love isn't constrained by borders. It isn't defined by proximity. It isn't even governed by tradition. Instead, it emerges where honesty, respect, warmth, and shared values meet, across oceans, across histories, across differences. And for Ukrainian women and Filipino husbands alike, that was the true foundation of their choice. The love stories emerging between Ukrainian women and Filipino men began transforming not just couples, but entire families. When Sofia introduced her fiancé Antonio to her parents in Lviv, they braced themselves for awkwardness. Instead, they met a man who asked thoughtful questions, listened to their concerns, and spoke with sincere warmth about his intentions. He didn't rush. He didn't impress with grandiose promises. He simply demonstrated patience, respect, and curiosity about each story they shared. That grounded presence shifted something in Sofia's father, who had long muted his emotions behind stoic silence. With Antonio, he found a conversational space he hadn't known he was missing. Over Easter dinner, adjusted to celebrate both Ukrainian and Filipino customs, laughter echoed in the room, not forced, but genuine. Conversations meandered from cultural traditions to shared hopes for the future, and in that space, the two families found common ground. By the time plates were cleared, the air was warmer, softer, and infused with mutual respect. It wasn't simply acceptance they witnessed, it was integration. Love had opened doors not just between two individuals, but between entire family legacies that once seemed too distant to ever coexist. Yet, even amid celebration, there were moments of doubt, anxiety, and introspection. Marrying across cultures isn't just about mutual affection. It demands emotional labor, cultural humility, and the willingness to constantly learn. Oksana, a journalist from Poltava, chose Miguel, a teacher from Negros Island, not because their differences disappeared, but because they learned to sit with them. Their relationship was not tear-jerking fairy tale bliss. It was a daily commitment to listening deeply, repatriating assumptions, and building rituals that honored both her heritage and his. When Miguel first met Oksana's grandparents, he bowed respectfully, not out of performance, but out of genuine reverence for their lineage and traditions. He listened patiently as they recited stories of history, struggle, and resilience. And when those elder voices spoke of pride, nostalgia, and even generational grief, Miguel didn't retreat. Instead, he nodded with sincerity, thanking them for sharing. That kind of presence, steady, patient, humble, spoke louder than any of the trappings valorized on social media. Love, in these unions, was less about perfection and more about steadfast presence, the choice to stay present even when discomfort flickered in the margins of cultural misunderstanding. It was that very willingness to stay, learn, and grow that deepened the bonds and offered a stable foundation for each couple's future. Meanwhile, Ukrainian women themselves were becoming voices of inspiration. On social platforms, they shared reflections seldom spoken openly in their own cultural spaces. That love thrives where vulnerability is met with patience, where communication isn't transactional but relational, and where emotional intelligence isn't rare but expected. One woman wrote, "I didn't choose him because he's Filipino. I chose him because he treats feelings as sacred territory, not as a threat." Another said, "In his language, softness is not weakness, it's wisdom." These sentiments weren't poetic exaggerations. They were reflections of lived experience. Ukrainian women who had felt dismissed, unheard, or emotionally fatigued in previous relationships found in Filipino partners a willingness to stay in the hard conversations. They didn't minimize pain, nor did they hurry through silence. Instead, they embraced depth, a trait that resonated deeply with women raised in societies where strength was often conflated with emotional restraint. Through this shared language of care, women began reclaiming relational courage. Courage to ask big questions, to reveal old wounds, to hope again without fear of dismissal. What blossomed was not dependency, but reciprocity, a mutual exchange of emotional presence that reshaped how both partners understood themselves and their capacity to love. The growing narrative of these unions began attracting academic interest. Universities in Kiev and Manila hosted dialogues exploring how globalization, digital communication, and cross-cultural empathy redefine modern relationships. Professors of sociology and anthropology noted that love, once localized by geography, was now contextualized by values. These weren't superficial affairs. They were deep relational experiments where communication, culture, and caring met in digital spaces first, then real lives. Research showed that many Filipino men brought relational skills shaped by community participation, extended family dynamics, and cultural emphasis on compassion. Meanwhile, Ukrainian women brought resilience forged in adversity, surviving war, displacement, and emotional fragmentation, and sought partnerships grounded in steadiness and mutual support. The fusion of these relational skills created something unexpected, a new relational paradigm that balanced emotional expressiveness with grounded resilience. Workshops emerged, where couples taught about conflict, empathy, cross-cultural rituals, and the art of intercontinental compromise. And as academic interest matured, so did public respect for these stories, not as curiosities, but as models of relational innovation in an evolving global landscape. Not all unions were easy, of course. Distance forced some couples to confront the hardest questions. Where will we live? What career paths will we follow? How will we raise children? Veronica and her husband Jose, for example, had long conversations about identity, belonging, and environment before choosing where to settle. They envisioned a family life that honored both heritage, Mardi Gras-like Ukrainian celebrations juxtaposed with joyful Filipino fiestas. Instead of seeing these celebrations as competing influences, they regarded them as layers of identity their future children would carry proudly. Their conversations were long and sometimes tense, but never superficial. Veronica realized that marriage wasn't a destination. It was a process of continuous negotiation, compromise, and celebration. These decisions weren't impulsive, but intentional steps toward building a life reflective of both their stories. And when they finally built a home that married these cultural imprints, embroidered Ukrainian threads alongside Filipino woven art, it wasn't just decor. It was representation, a living testament to two histories coexisting not in conflict, but in harmony. These homes became shared symbols not only of love, but of shared creative identity. Media outlets began to reflect on how these relationships were reframing what it meant to date, court, and marry beyond borders. Journalists wrote about love that didn't shrink from complexity, it expanded through it. Relationships once confined to geographic proximity now spanned oceans, calendars, and linguistic barriers, not as temporary infatuations, but as enduring emotional partnerships. Ukrainian women who once hesitated to trust again found solace in partners who honored emotional communication and long-term loyalty. Filipino husbands, who often grew up with intergenerational influence of extended family care, found in their Ukrainian partners a deep respect for emotional resilience and grit. What surprised many observers wasn't that these unions happened, but how grounded they were. They weren't romantic fantasies. They were relational art forms molded by care, conflict resolution, compromise, and wonder. And as these stories gained attention, couples began sharing their reflections on podcasts, in interviews, and at cultural symposiums, not to broadcast novelty, but to validate sincere relational cultures where love meant engagement, presence, and authenticity, rather than performance or expectation. Within the Ukrainian diaspora, these stories began reshaping diasporic identities as well. Women who had migrated to Europe and North America recounted how their friendships with Filipino men reminded them that home doesn't necessarily mean geography, it means emotional safety. Their tales weren't escapist fantasies, but grounded testimonies born out of sustained care. They spoke of dinners where borscht and adobo coexisted on the same table, and family introductions where laughter over language mishaps became cherished rituals. The marriages that once seemed surprising now served as bridges, quietly connecting communities that had rarely sought each other's stories before. Cultural festivals in cities like Toronto, Warsaw, and Berlin began inviting Filipino-Ukrainian couples to speak about their blended identities, celebrating how Ukrainian resilience met Filipino compassion to form strikingly strong unions. People began to see these relationships not as anomalies but cultural fusions capable of teaching the world about emotional reciprocity, cultural humility, and the wisdom of honoring both selves in partnership instead of subsuming one into the other. In certain cities, community centers organized events where Filipino and Ukrainian families shared traditions together, cooking exchanges and storytelling nights. At one event in Warsaw, elders from different backgrounds spoke of how they once believed love should follow tradition. Stay close, stay known, stay within cultural borders. Yet they now marveled aloud at how these unions rewrote those assumptions. A Ukrainian grandmother confessed that she never thought she'd hear her grandchildren sing Tagalog lullabies alongside Ukrainian folk songs, but cherished the musical mosaic that now filled her living room. Filipino uncles shared how they once imagined marriage as a duty to lineage and legacy, but now saw it as a living commitment to friendship, patience, and mutual exploration. These gatherings weren't performances, they were testimonies. Testimonies not just of love realized, but love that evolves identity, a love that doesn't erase heritage but amplifies it. The event ended with laughter, dancing, and shared feasts, not as spectacle, but as evidence of relational innovation, a living, breathing future of shared culture and affection. As the years passed, children born into these multicultural families displayed remarkable emotional intelligence. Some spoke Tagalog as fluently as Ukrainian, others stitched together linguistic blends that surprised the oldest translators. They didn't embody conflict between identities, they embodied synthesis. Schools noted their comfort in diverse environments, their readiness to learn multiple histories, and their fluency in navigating complex emotional landscapes. They didn't see cultural difference as a barrier, but as enrichment. Teachers shared stories of children bridging playground divides, encouraging classmates to share their family customs, and translating Tagalog lullabies for peers whose heritage was different. What sociologists once studied in textbooks began appearing in classrooms as living relational naturalization. These children, heirs of cross-continental unions, weren't just blending cultures. They were laying foundations for future generations who understood empathy, flexibility, and relational creativity from their earliest days. Their presence was testament not just to love between adults, but to the possibility of a world where cultural synthesis becomes the norm, not the exception. Yet the story wasn't romanticized without complexity, and it wasn't meant to be. Love across cultures demands constant negotiation, humility, patience, and courage. There were moments of grief when homesickness struck. There were times when conversations felt slow and awkward, when language barriers reminded couples how much work relational communication truly requires. Filipino husbands learned the weight of Ukrainian history and trauma. Ukrainian wives learned the beauty of communal joy and familial warmth. These exchanges didn't erase difference. They illuminated it, inviting couples to grow with it, not against it. They learned that relationships aren't about erasing the past, but integrating their stories into a shared narrative full of compassion, resilience, and reverence. These unions weren't perfect. They were intentional. And in their intention, they reshaped not just romantic norms, but the very idea of what love can look like when it crosses borders, not in search of escape, but in pursuit of mutual belonging. This was not a fleeting trend. It was a testament to humanity's capacity to love widely, deeply, and without reservation. As these relationships matured, they began to shape the way broader communities thought about belonging itself. Women who once felt rooted in one place now carried dual identities with grace, neither exclusive nor competing, but coexisting. Their stories rippled outward, inspiring others to reconsider what attachment meant in a world increasingly defined by movement, displacement, and digital intersection. Because of war, because of separation from homes and old routines, many Ukrainian women had developed a heightened emotional awareness, an ability to read between lines, carry resilience, and find depth where others saw none. Filipino partners, raised in cultures that valued emotional warmth, family closeness, and expressive care, offered something complementary to that awareness: patience, empathy, and a willingness to invest time in understanding the heart before rushing to define it. The combination, resilience and emotional generosity, began to be recognized not merely as compatibility, but as evolutionary relational intelligence. These women weren't rejecting their past. They were expanding their capacity to connect. And in doing so, they invited the world to see that love isn't limited by borders. It thrives where depth is honored, feelings are taken seriously, and companionship is a crafted art, not a checkbox to be ticked. The growing cultural conversation also called attention to the brave decisions these women made early on in their journeys, decisions that often went unseen. They weren't simply choosing managers of stability, nor escaping tradition. They were refusing to settle for emotional emptiness, inconsistency, indifference, or casual attachment. These women, shaped by their histories, by war, loss, disruption, and emotional resilience, brought with them expectations of emotional depth that demanded sincerity. They weren't impressed by bravado or charm alone. They were moved by consistency, depth, and humility. Likewise, Filipino husbands offered relational styles less common in traditional Ukrainian dating contexts, not avoidance, not emotional detachment, but persistent engagement. They listened without imposing answers. They reflected without minimizing. They cared without needing to be convinced that vulnerability was weakness. And in that space of mutual curiosity, trust grew spontaneously, not artificially. These relational patterns became so compelling that social scientists began noting them as emergent models of modern union, not because they were widespread yet, but because they signaled something remarkably transformative: love as mutual discovery, rather than conquest. Indeed, the narrative was shifting from who chooses whom to who listens to whom, and that distinction became more powerful than anyone had anticipated. Among the countless stories that defined this cultural phenomenon, there were tales that sounded almost surreal in their subtlety, not because they were implausible, but because they were deeply human. Irina, a psychologist from Kiev, once shared that her journey with Ramon, a Filipino nurse, didn't hinge on fireworks or dramatic emotions. It hinged on patience. She recalled nights of long conversations where neither of them pretended perfection. Instead, they admitted flaws, acknowledged insecurities, and learned to ask difficult questions without fear of rejection. They didn't rush toward destination. They savored presence. And it was in that slow, unhurried communion that trust cemented. With each shared sunrise, each text message of encouragement, each moment of listening without judgment, their bond deepened not because it was easy, but because it was authentic. When Irina spoke publicly about their union, she said something that echoed far beyond romantic love. Ramon didn't save me. He helped me rediscover myself. It wasn't poetry, it was truth. For many women like Irina, that realization, that they weren't being rescued but recognized, became the foundation upon which durable relationships were built. And it was this very recognition, the feeling of being truly known, that propelled these unions into something enduring rather than momentary. The exchange of culture in these partnerships wasn't superficial or symbolic. It was visceral. Filipino husbands learned Ukrainian recipes, mastered the names of traditional festivals, and listened attentively to stories of ancestral heritage. Ukrainian wives learned Tagalog expressions of affection, participated in Filipino family celebrations, and sought meaning in traditions they had once found unfamiliar. These were not Instagram-ready snapshots of cultural fusion. They were lived experiences that interwove daily life with reverence and curiosity. One Filipino husband, Luis, proudly sang Ukrainian lullabies to his children, while also teaching them classic Tagalog poems. Conversely, his wife Oksana began preparing pancit and adobo for family gatherings in Kiev, explaining to her relatives the timeline of Filipino feasts and why certain songs held cultural significance. These were not shallow cross-cultural guest appearances. They were acts of belonging, willingness, and mutual homage. In blending traditions, they weren't diluting identities. Instead, they were strengthening them, honoring the past while constructing a shared future. And as more families like this emerged, they became living bridges across oceans, living proof that beloved customs could intertwine beautifully, without erasing the integrity of either culture. Religious and spiritual conversations also surfaced in surprising ways. Some couples held dual celebrations, blending Easter with Simbang Gabi, Christmas with Noche Buena, honoring both Ukrainian and Filipino traditions with equal reverence. These celebrations were not awkward fusions. They were harmonies, not compromises. A Filipino husband who had grown up attending novenas and community masses found himself learning Ukrainian Orthodox prayers with the same reverence he once reserved only for his own rituals. Likewise, Ukrainian wives witnessed Filipino fiestas filled with music and laughter that extended well into dawn, and some began adopting those joyous approaches to celebration within their own families. Religion, once a potential point of difference, became a canvas for shared spiritual expression. There were moments of confusion and questions, certainly, but more often, there were moments of mutual respect and reverence. They didn't share identical doctrines, but they shared sacred respect for each other's emotional language of faith. In this co-created spiritual space, questions like, how do we pray together, became opportunities for unity, not conflict. And in those shared prayers, laughter, and conversations, the notion that spiritual life must be singular began to dissolve, replaced by the beautiful possibility that faith can be plural and shared. Not all families took to these unions immediately. There were initial waves of skepticism and concern, questions about distance, linguistic barriers, and cultural expectations. Some grandparents wondered aloud whether such relationships could truly endure. But time, presence, and emotional consistency provided answers far stronger than any reassurance could. When Daria introduced her Filipino husband Joel to her extended family, she braced herself for judgment. Instead, she witnessed silence, not hostile, but thoughtful. Over the course of the evening, what followed wasn't awkwardness but dialogue. Questions were asked, answers were offered. And rather than dismiss differences, both sides leaned into curiosity. Joel spoke of Filipino customs with humility and respect. Daria's family shared their ancestral stories with pride. By the end of the night, even skeptics admitted that what they saw wasn't a superficial attraction, but a genuine relational commitment. They saw how Joel approached conversations with soft, attentive eyes, how he walked with sincerity rather than assertion. And in that demonstration of consistent respect, old fears began to dissipate. It wasn't instant acceptance. It was earned understanding. And earned understanding, unlike forced affirmation, carried far deeper weight. Meanwhile, public figures began to take note. Influencers, artists, and cultural commentators shared the stories with nuance, highlighting how these relationships reflected broader shifts in global emotional intelligence. Some Ukrainian social commentators pointed out that the shared experience of trauma, enduring war, displacement, and emotional uncertainty heightened the desire for emotional partnership built on patience, empathy, and depth. Filipino public figures, on the other hand, emphasized how the warmth of community and family values resonated with global sensibilities of belonging and mutual care. These voices didn't treat the phenomenon as a trend. They treated it as part of a larger conversation about how humans increasingly seek relational depth, not superficial connection. Podcasts began hosting couples to talk about communication styles, conflict resolution, and cultural rituals that enriched their bonds. Universities held virtual forums discussing cross-cultural empathy and how these relationships challenged the old paradigms of dating confined to cultural borders. As these dialogues proliferated, what once appeared niche became a valuable case study in modern relational dynamics, a testament to how emotional values, not nationality, increasingly define what people seek in lifelong partnerships. Despite the many beautiful stories, the journey was never without struggle. Some couples faced discrimination, not from outright hostility, but from well-meaning friends and relatives who simply couldn't imagine love outside familiar frameworks. These women sometimes had to defend not just their relationship, but their right to define it on their own terms. And Filipino husbands occasionally navigated comments rooted in misunderstanding, where people assumed their intentions were superficial or transactional. In response, these couples developed something profound: relational resilience. They learned how to stand together under critique without becoming brittle. They cultivated shared language around disagreement, self-advocacy, and conflict, not as battles to be won, but shared conversations to be held with care. These moments of adversity became not threats to their union, but tests of its depth. And the relationships that endured through those tests grew stronger, not because they avoided pain, but because they learned to carry it together. The strength that emerged wasn't stoic silence, but collaborative vulnerability, the willingness to show wounds without fear of judgment. In homes across continents, the meaning of family was evolving. It was no longer defined strictly by geography or bloodline. It was defined by intention, commitment, and emotional presence. Children with Ukrainian and Filipino heritage learned more than 2 languages. They learned adaptiveness, empathy, and cultural fluency from the moment they spoke their first words. They saw grandparents from both sides share stories of struggle and celebration, creating interwoven narratives that neither replaced history nor ignored it. These children did not inherit conflict. They inherited dialogue. They didn't carry tension between identities. They carried synthesis. And in seeing their parents navigate differences with patience and curiosity, they learned that marriage wasn't a static state, but a continuous process of learning, unlearning, and co-creation. These families didn't just blend traditions. They articulated new ones, rituals that honored the past while welcoming the future. In doing so, they began modeling a new form of family identity, one that wasn't constrained by borders, but enriched by them. By now, the story had grown beyond individual unions. It had become a movement, not noisy or exploitative, but quietly profound in its implications for how humans choose to love. It showed the world that love is not confined to familiar borders, cultural proximity, or ingrained tradition alone. Instead, love flourishes where emotional availability, mutual respect, and sustained presence are honored above all else. For Ukrainian women, finding Filipino partners wasn't an escape from upheaval. It was a search for belonging that met them where they were, emotionally, relationally, and vulnerably. For Filipino husbands, these unions were not exotic ventures. They were invitations to shared humanity, deeper empathy, and sacrificial love. And in every wedding vow spoken, every child raised, and every holiday celebrated between cultures, the world saw that love's architecture is far larger than any one people, language, or origin. It is something fluid and expansive, something that, when given space, flourishes beyond expectation. What these cross-continental relationships eventually demonstrated was not only how love can traverse distances, but how emotional intelligence and relational maturity can reshape entire cultural narratives. In many Ukrainian communities, initial skepticism gradually softened into admiration as stories of Filipino-Ukrainian families began to resonate with deeper human values, patience, mutual respect, and emotional availability. People began asking not why these unions happened, but how they sustained themselves through differences in language, tradition, and history. Couples talked candidly about the challenges they faced, disagreements about rituals, misunderstandings about expectations, concerns from extended family, and more importantly, how they resolved those challenges with curiosity and care rather than resentment and avoidance. They revealed that what made their relationship strong was not the absence of conflict, but the freedom to speak honestly about it. In relationships across cultures, walls often come down not because conflicts vanish, but because couples choose vulnerability over avoidance and empathy over defensiveness. This kind of relational courage became a key theme in conversations about modern love, illustrating that authenticity and emotional honesty are far more important than perfect compatibility. In classrooms, community forums, and online spaces dedicated to relational growth, this insight became a powerful lesson that the maturity of a relationship isn't measured by how little it argues, but by how respectfully and openly it communicates when it does. The children born into these Filipino-Ukrainian unions became ambassadors of shared culture without even knowing it. They carried in their laughter the tones of 2 worlds, in their holiday celebrations, the rhythms of 2 traditions. Teachers remarked on their remarkable adaptability and emotional awareness, not because these children were exceptional in talent, but because they had internalized relational diversity as a way of life. In their classrooms, they introduced classmates to Tagalog greetings and Ukrainian folktales with equal joy. In doing so, they dismantled stereotypes not through debate, but through everyday interaction. Their peers didn't just learn facts about different cultures, they learned empathy through shared experience. In many ways, these children embodied a form of global citizenship that was unforced, natural, and deeply grounded in relational awareness. This was not cultural dilution, but cultural amplification, a blending that honored both ancestral roots while celebrating the unique identity that each child carried. Parents often reflected on how their children seemed to navigate emotional landscapes with an ease that surpassed that of many adults, not because they were perfect, but because they had lived emotional reciprocity from infancy, hearing two languages, absorbing two cultural value systems, and responding with a confidence that bridged divides rather than deepening them. Universities and cultural institutions began documenting this phenomenon not as a fleeting curiosity, but as a meaningful contribution to global relational anthropology. Researchers studied how Filipino relational ethos, which emphasized shared identity, kapwa, empathy, and familial warmth, intersected with Ukrainian resilience and emotional intensity to produce uniquely balanced relational dynamics. These unions weren't just romantic. They were social experiments in emotional synchrony. One paper published by an international journal of cultural psychology noted how couples practiced what the authors termed relational survival skills, techniques rooted in sustained emotional attunement rather than defensive emotional withdrawal. These skills included compassionate listening, iterative reflection, where both partners repeated back what they heard before responding, and shared vulnerability exercises. The researchers emphasized that while not all Filipino-Ukrainian couples used these methods consciously, many developed similar patterns intuitively, patterns that foreground listening as relational labor and empathy as a practice, not a concept. Workshops and seminars began offering relational tools based on these patterns, attracting couples from all cultural backgrounds interested in strengthening their own partnerships. What began as a series of love stories between distant cultures had evolved into a broader paradigm shift in how we understand love as an active, intentional, and emotionally literate practice. In many ways, social media played a double role. It was the platform where initial connections started, but it also became the venue where wisdom from these relationships was shared. Ukrainian women started creating content about cross-cultural communication. Filipino husbands shared their reflections on patience and relational presence, and couples co-hosted live conversations about how they navigated cultural rituals, language barriers, and family dynamics. These platforms weren't just broadcasting romance. They were educating. They offered free, real-time insights into how people build relational bridges, resolve conflict with compassion, and integrate dual traditions into shared family life. Comments on these videos weren't just expressions of admiration. They were conversations about emotional growth, self-reflection, and the courage to love beyond familiar borders. One popular Ukrainian content creator shared a message that resonated with thousands. "I didn't choose love across cultures because it was easy. I chose it because it honored all parts of me." Filipino husbands responded with similar reflections about how their relationships taught them patience, adaptability, and emotional honesty. These exchanges helped broaden the narrative from romantic novelty to relational literacy, inspiring couples globally to see emotional vulnerability not as a flaw, but as a foundation for enduring love. As these relationships deepened, many Filipino-Ukrainian families began creating shared life scripts, intentional narratives that honored both cultures in everyday practice. Sunday dinners might include adobo and borscht. Celebrations alternated between Christmas midnight mass and simbang gabi traditions. Children learned Tagalog lullabies and Ukrainian folk songs with equal reverence, and holidays were not points of conflict but opportunities for enriched family identity. These blended customs became organic, not forced, a testament to how love can expand rituals rather than replace them. Couples described how these traditions gave their children a deep sense of rooted belonging in both worlds, fostering pride in dual heritage rather than confusion. What stood out most was not the fusion alone, but the intentional reverence couples brought to every shared moment, an earnest recognition that these rituals were more than symbolic. They were anchors of identity. Family elders, initially hesitant or unsure, often became cheerleaders of this cultural integration, delighted to see celebrations that carried warmth, laughter, depth, and generational attachment. In these homes, culture wasn't debated. It was lived, breathed, shared, and cherished in ways that honored both past and future. Yet, not all journeys were smooth. Some Filipino-Ukrainian couples faced the more invisible challenges of identity negotiation, internal questions about where they belonged when neither country felt fully home. This internal negotiation was not a sign of instability, Rather, it was a rite of passage many couples worked through together. They learned to articulate what home really meant. For some, it was a geography, the land of cherished memories. For others, it was emotional safety or a shared space where their children could feel secure and celebrated. These conversations weren't simple. They prompted couples to dismantle assumptions, revise personal narratives, and reframe stories of belonging not as static but as evolving. It was here, in these reflections, that emotional intimacy deepened most powerfully. Couples began describing home not as a place on the map, but as a felt experience anchored in presence, mutual respect, and shared vulnerability. These dialogues became some of the most challenging yet transformative aspects of their relationships. And as they walked through them together, they discovered something profound. Love isn't about fitting into a predetermined place. It's about co-creating a space where both partners feel seen, honored, and understood. The emotional maturity born from these cross-cultural experiences began influencing community values, not just within Filipino-Ukrainian families, but in broader social circles. Couples became egalitarian models of partnership, demonstrating how relationships thrive on shared leadership, mutual care, and continuous communication. They rejected the outdated narrative that love must be hierarchical or possessive. Instead, their bonds were marked by collaboration, respect, and intentional companionship. Friends watched as disagreements became opportunities for growth rather than sources of resentment. Extended family members witnessed how couples resolved conflict with dignified generosity rather than ego. These shifts didn't go unnoticed. Community leaders, educators, and youth organizers began studying the relational patterns in these families as examples of healthy emotional ecosystems, not romantic cliches, but real-world models of love that replenished rather than depleted the individuals involved. In workshops, adults shared how observing these couples inspired them to rethink their own relationships. Teens talked about emotional honesty instead of emotional performativity. And in homes across cities, the language of love grew richer, more nuanced, and deeply anchored in shared emotional literacy. In cities like Manila, Kyiv, Warsaw, and Edmonton, intercontinental weddings became gatherings not only of two individuals but of bridged worlds. In these ceremonies, Ukrainian wedding traditions fused with Filipino hospitality, as if the very act of marriage itself was teaching the world how to value both heritage and hybridity simultaneously. Music from both cultures played harmoniously, and elders from both sides offered blessings in languages not everyone understood but everyone felt. Guests didn't just celebrate the union of two people, they witnessed the fusion of relational paradigms. Stories of resilience met narratives of joyful surrender. Stories of survival met narratives of warmth. Historical remembrance met cultural celebration. And in that shared space, families discovered the profound truth that love doesn't require sameness. It demands attention, care, sacrifice, and joyful presence. These weddings weren't merely ceremonies. They were cultural milestones, markers of what human connection looks like when individuals refuse to let fear dictate intimacy and instead choose empathy, unity, and relational courage. Public policymakers began taking notice too. With increasing numbers of Ukrainian women choosing Filipino husbands and planning long-term life together, discussions emerged around immigration policy, family support services, and bilateral cultural initiatives aimed at supporting dual citizenship families. Governments began offering language support programs, cultural orientation workshops, and legal assistance to help ease the transition for families navigating cross-border life decisions. These weren't token gestures. They were practical acknowledgments that love, when acted upon, creates real logistical needs: housing, healthcare access, education, and community integration. Policy experts highlighted how these families represented a new form of global citizenship, not transactional or migratory for economic gain, but relational and emotionally grounded. As a result, cultural exchange programs expanded, offering opportunities for deeper educational collaboration between schools in Ukraine and the Philippines. What once started as personal love stories blossomed into policy conversations about how nations can support emotional connectivity beyond borders. And as these dialogues matured, they offered a reminder that love, when backed by community and institutional support, can transform not just hearts, but societies in subtle yet meaningful ways. Meanwhile, everyday life continued to weave its priceless tapestries in the homes of Filipino-Ukrainian families. Routine mornings filled with breakfast conversations, commutes in shared silence, and evenings spent comparing stories from distant cities became the quiet miracles of daily existence. These moments, seemingly mundane but deeply shared, defined what love looked like beyond romance, a daily practice of presence. Children grew up seeing emotional honesty modeled in disputes resolved with care, in personal vulnerabilities embraced without judgment, in laughter that echoed through living rooms decorated with dual cultural symbols. The beauty of these relationships wasn't in how dramatic they were, it was in how real and sustainable they felt. Couples didn't have perfect lives. They had perfect choices. The choice to show up, to listen, to learn, to hold space for someone else's story. And through these choices, they built families not bounded by geography, tradition, or expectation, but by shared humanity. These families became evidence that love knows no borders and that emotional connection, when genuinely nurtured, can rewrite what the world once assumed about who we can love, how we can love, and what love can become. By the time these cross-continental families had established roots, something remarkable had happened. The narrative of love had shifted in both Ukraine and the Philippines. Love was no longer framed as a localized experience, confined to familiar customs, expected rites of passage, or predefined relational templates. Instead, it was understood as relational courage, and many families discovered that courage not through ease, but through the grit of continuous choice. Couples didn't simply tell romantic anecdotes. They described how love persisted through miscommunication, cultural confusion, and times of hardship. They spoke openly about how they had to unlearn bias, pause defensiveness, and practice compassion in ways that transformed not just their partnerships, but their internal emotional landscapes. And the people around them began to see that love wasn't the closure of independence, but the expansion of it. In workshops, parents said that watching these relationships unfold taught them more about emotional safety than anything they'd learned in decades of traditional practice. Children absorb relational cues from parents. These families were raising a generation that understood vulnerability not as weakness, but as relational language. Schools reported lower bullying rates among children from these families. Psychologists began citing them as exemplars of adaptive emotional intelligence. These weren't isolated stories. They were blueprints for relational futures grounded in empathy, not dominance. Relational activists and educators began to bring voices from Filipino-Ukrainian families into public spaces where people talked about how to love well. These weren't merely narratives about romance. They were frameworks that addressed emotional literacy, intergenerational compassion, and intentional listening. Weekly community meetups in Warsaw, Vilnius, and Toronto featured couples teaching conflict resolution through presence rather than forcefulness. A seminar titled Beyond Borders, Within Hearts became a recurring event where families shared stories of negotiation, ritual fusion, and daily emotional practice. One panel speaker, a Filipino-Ukrainian couple with preschool children, spoke about how they decided to slow down their responses, choosing empathy before defense, even when cultural norms pushed them toward conflict or withdrawal. Their message resonated. Loving well is not instinctive, it is intentional. In a world where quick attraction and immediate gratification often overshadow substance, these couples reminded audiences that love is sustained care over time. They talked about arguments that ended in mutual reflection rather than blame, and tears that became gateways to deeper understanding instead of signs of rupture. Schools invited them to speak with teenagers about emotional safety and authentic connection. And as their voices echoed in auditoriums, lecture halls, and online forums, the narrative of love was once again being rewritten, not by convenience, but by care that persists. Meanwhile, love continued to translate into everyday acts, not grand declarations, but sustained presence. Nadia and Marco must have seemed like a conventional couple to anyone glancing their family photos. Christmases decked with Ukrainian paisanki eggs and beautifully embroidered barongs for Filipino fiestas, pastel-colored balikbayan boxes waiting to be opened, and children who greeted every celebration with wide curiosity and joy. But what wasn't visible in those static snapshots were the hundreds of conversations that shaped their union, slow talks about future fears, weekly reflections about emotional needs, and daily acts of support even when exhaustion threatened to consume them. Relationships built on such patterns didn't exist in a vacuum. They carried into the world. Friends who once saw love as performance began to view it as practice. Individuals who had once defined relationship success by proximity or routine now saw it through adaptive integrity. At work, colleagues noted that Marco handled stress with grounded patience, a quality he attributed to listening to Nadia's emotional rhythms. Nadia's empathy deepened as she integrated Filipino relational warmth into her own cultural identity. Love in these homes wasn't static. It was life. It was present in routines, nestled into conversation cadence, embedded in the laughter of children straddling two cultures with pride. The world began to take note not because these stories were exotic, but because they were real. They weren't cherry-picked for spectacle. They were enduring, messy, beautiful, and sometimes painful, just like real life. Ukrainian and Filipino public figures began referencing these unions as evidence of human resilience and emotional intelligence. A cultural anthology published in Kiev featured essays from Ukrainian women in relationships with Filipino husbands, each one weaving vulnerability and strength into narratives about what it means to love authentically after trauma. Filipino communities echoed this perspective, celebrating the warmth these relationships introduced to cross-continental empathy. Cultural historians noted that these unions were not merely relational, they were social artifacts, testimonies to how globalization meets emotional maturity, not just economic exchange. These stories didn't dilute cultural identities. They expanded them. Ukrainian women carried pride in traditional embroidery and war-scarred resilience into Filipino homes. Filipino husbands carried warmth, familial devotion, and a distinct relational humility into Ukrainian gatherings. This was not an erasure of heritage, it was heritage enhancement. And as these blended families lived their lives, they became living testimonies to the beauty and challenge of intentional love in the 21st century. In one particularly poignant story, Ola, a Ukrainian man whose sister married Amara, a Filipino software engineer, described how he initially feared the union would dissolve under pressure. But when he witnessed how they practiced daily emotional check-ins and shared laughter even in disagreement, his skepticism dissolved. They don't hide their struggles, he said. They carry them together. And this capacity, to carry rather than hide, became a recurring theme among these couples. Others echoed similar sentiments. Partnerships rooted in shared emotional labor proved more resilient in the face of stress, displacement, and life transitions than relationships built solely on proximity. Friends who once defined stability by sameness began seeing it as mutual adaptability. Libraries began offering books co-authored by these couples on cultural fusion, emotional practice, and relational ritual building. Cartography of love was no longer horizontal. It expanded vertically into the core of human emotional experience. What couples gained through these partnerships was not just marital bliss. It was a vocabulary for emotional honesty, a framework for cultural integration, and a posture of relational imagination that refused to settle for anything less than vital presence. Churches, temples, and spiritual communities in both Ukraine and the Philippines began welcoming these blended families with open arms, often incorporating elements from both traditions into spiritual rites. A Filipino-Ukrainian baby might be baptized with prayers drawn from both traditions, honoring the juncture of two religious worlds. Weddings integrated rites that celebrated heritage and future promise. In these sacred spaces, elders from both lineages offered blessings that were neither forced nor diluted, but co-created. They didn't erase differences, they cherished them. This approach to spiritual life wasn't syncretism for convenience. It was intentional reverence for two worlds merging in mutual respect. Spiritual leaders began drawing lessons from these families about how faith can be a bridge rather than a boundary. Sermons referenced compassion and presence as core attributes of enduring relationships. These unions didn't contest spiritual values, they expanded them, demonstrating that religious life can be flexible without losing meaning. In these sacred moments, love became more than emotional union. It became spiritual intersection, a place where two different faith traditions stood side by side, not in conflict, but in concord. The social impact spread further into education and youth culture, where children of these unions became symbols of possibility. They learned to navigate differences with ease, to ask questions with curiosity, and to answer them with kindness. In classrooms, they taught peers about Tagalog phrases and Ukrainian folktales with equal confidence. Their teachers noticed that these children often became empathy leaders in group activities, students who knit stray or isolated classmates into conversations with gentle encouragement rather than insistence. These children, shaped by cross-cultural belonging, didn't see others as different. They saw others as human first, and that perspective became contagious. Schools began inviting Filipino-Ukrainian families to discuss emotional expression, cultural heritage, and companionship that honors both self and other. Youth groups, once focused narrowly on local traditions, began exploring global relational diversity as a path toward compassionate universality. These children didn't carry the burden of difference as tension. They carried it as a synthesis of identity, history, and belonging. In doing so, they taught those around them that relational empathy transcends cultural boundaries and reshapes emotional landscapes not through critique, but through genuine exchange. Public storytelling spaces, podcasts, radio interviews, and community forums became vibrant hubs for Filipino-Ukrainian couples to speak about what keeps them together through life's inevitable challenges. They talked about mistakes that became growth points, disappointments that became lessons in patience, and joys that were deepened by shared appreciation. These conversations weren't polished or idealistic. They were real. They included moments of doubt, economic strain, and cultural misunderstanding, and the ways couples navigated those moments with care rather than avoidance. One couple shared how, during a particularly difficult winter in Kiev, they held weekly heart check-ins, where they asked each other about emotional needs rather than logistical tasks. This ritual didn't just keep them aligned, it strengthened their emotional infrastructure. People who listened to these stories didn't walk away seeing only romance. They heard practice. They saw how love, when acted upon with intention rather than drama, becomes resilient, stable, and life-affirming. Podcast host after host remarked that these weren't stories designed to sell dreams. They were grounded testaments to relational work defined by kindness, continuity, and mutual growth. In international forums, Filipino-Ukrainian families began to be cited as examples of how global relational ecosystems can bridge civilizations without erasing uniqueness. They became symbols of exchange, showing that emotional connection isn't constrained by language or landscape. It is illuminated by shared values. Anthropologists studied the role of emotional reciprocity in sustaining these unions. Sociologists analyzed how dual identities strengthen relational stability. Psychologists noted how children from these families exhibited higher levels of cross-cultural fluency and emotional adaptability. The academic world, once distant from personal narrative, began respecting these stories not as anomalies, but as evidential insights into what the future of love could hold. Love, they concluded, is not limited by borders. It is expanded by empathy. And as journals, conferences, and educational institutions explored this phenomenon, something remarkable emerged: a global conversation about how relationships can be models of relational education, teaching not only those within couples, but entire communities, about nuance, care, and listening not as reaction, but as practice. And so this story of Ukrainian women and Filipino husbands is not just a story of love across distance. It is a testament to how humans can love deeply in a fractured world. It shows that love is not sentimental. It is intentional, crafted daily through presence, communication, humility, and mutual respect. These couples didn't transcend difference. They honored difference. They didn't escape cultural boundaries. They expanded them. They didn't seek uniformity. They cultivated shared belonging. Their unions became living proofs that love isn't hindered by geography. It is supported by values. It thrives where vulnerability is met with care, where dialogue replaces judgment, and where shared humanity becomes the soil from which emotional resilience grows. In every embrace that crosses oceans, in every vow that honors two worlds, in every child raised with dual heritage, we see that love, when nurtured with presence and humility, can redefine identity, community, and belonging. And that, perhaps, is the greatest testament of all, that humanity's capacity to love widely, deeply, and authentically can reshape the very concept of what it means to be connected in a world defined by difference.